Yesterday, literally yesterday, Canada made a move that could reshape North American agriculture for an entire decade. While most people slept, Prime Minister Mark Carney was in Beijing, shaking hands with Xi Jinping and quietly rewriting a food supply chain that has sustained America for 70 years. On the surface, the deal looked simple. Canada would slash tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and China would reduce its punishing tariffs on Canadian canola from 85% to 15%. Yet, the true implications of this agreement go far beyond trade numbers or bilateral courtesy. Hidden within the deal is a seismic shift in global food politics. Canada has now positioned itself as China's primary agricultural partner in North America, and American food processors are about to feel the consequences in ways they haven't fully anticipated. This didn't happen overnight. It's the culmination of choices and pressures over the past year, from tariffs to trade disputes, all colliding in real time. 6 months ago, President Trump began imposing 25% tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, ostensibly to address trade deficits and border security. The unintended consequence? He pushed one of America's closest allies straight into China's orbit. Carney's trip to Beijing yesterday finalized agreements that will reverberate across global agriculture, setting the stage for long-term structural changes that will be difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. Canada's role in global wheat production magnifies this effect. As the world's third-largest wheat exporter, controlling 15% of the market, Canadian wheat is deeply integrated into American grain systems, particularly in Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota, where domestic crops have been blended with Canadian wheat for decades. This integration is not optional, it's baked into the infrastructure, contracts, and logistics that keep supply chains running. Replacing Canadian wheat with alternatives from Australia or Argentina isn't just inconvenient, it's virtually impossible in the short term. But the real story lies in the domestic pressures that triggered Canada's pivot toward China. Canadian farmers faced a double hit: American tariffs blocking their southern market and China's 85% tariffs blocking their Asian market. The impact was devastating. Exports of canola plummeted by 70% between March and August of 2025, pork shipments fell 19%, and lobster and crab exports essentially stopped. Farmers watched warehouses fill with unsellable products as their livelihoods collapsed in real time. Confronted with this economic catastrophe, Carney made a strategic decision. He found a new partner, and that partner is China. This agreement, while publicly framed around canola and electric vehicles, marks the start of a broader strategic partnership encompassing energy, agriculture, and trade. Carney even stated that China has become a more predictable partner than the United States, a declaration that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Think about that. The Prime Minister of Canada, our neighbor and largest trading partner, publicly affirming that a communist state is more reliable than the United States. That is not just a statement, it's a seismic shift in strategic alignment. Canadian farmers currently making planting decisions for the upcoming spring are responding rationally to incentives. With multi-year contracts and premium pricing from Chinese buyers, while American buyers face uncertainty under tariffs, where do you think their seeds are going? They're planting for guaranteed markets, not political uncertainty. Over time, this will reshape logistics, rerouting supply chains toward Pacific shipping routes, attracting investment from Chinese state-owned enterprises into Canadian agricultural infrastructure, and making any reversal exponentially harder. This isn't a trade spat resolved in months. It's a fundamental reordering of North American agriculture that could take decades to undo. The impact on American consumers is already tangible. Wheat prices jumped 12% following the tariffs, translating into nearly $1,000 in extra annual food costs for a typical family of 4, covering bread, pasta, cereal, and baked goods alone. Yet the broader concern is not merely higher grocery bills. It's the dismantling of supply chain relationships meticulously built over 70 years. Consider a grain processing operation in Kansas, a family-owned business, employing 140 people. Their costs surged 28% after tariffs, yet passing these increases to customers risks losing contracts to foreign competitors. The choices are stark: absorb losses and risk bankruptcy or shut down, displacing an entire workforce. This scenario is replicated across the American agricultural supply chain, affecting farmers, transporters, processors, and the communities that rely on them. Trucking firms that move Canadian grain across borders are seeing volumes drop 40–60%, small family-run operations facing bankruptcy. Railways, port facilities, and storage facilities designed for integrated supply chains are all experiencing unprecedented uncertainty. Every link, from farm to table, is under strain. The biggest players in global grain trading are quietly adjusting to this new reality. These companies, which dictate food flows on a global scale, are reducing exposure to North American trade, prioritizing regulatory certainty over minimal cost savings. Investments in processing plants, storage, and logistics are shifting towards South America and Australia. American agricultural exports to Canada are already down 6% through September, representing $1.3 billion in lost trade, yet the most significant effects, planting choices, and long-term contracts are unfolding now. Canadian agricultural exports to China, worth $13 billion annually before tariffs, are set to double under Carney's strategy, targeting $250 billion in non-US markets. This plan directly reduces reliance on the unpredictable American market, cementing China as a primary partner. The strategic consequences are clear. North American agricultural integration is fracturing, and American influence over global food supply is slipping at an alarming pace. To understand the gravity of this shift, imagine a long-time customer at a bakery. You've bought bread there for 30 years, only to start demanding discounts, threatening to leave, and questioning whether you even need their bread. Eventually, the baker finds a new customer willing to pay premium prices and sign long-term contracts. By the time you return, the baker has moved on. That's precisely what's happening in North American agriculture. Canadian wheat and canola are no longer guaranteed for American buyers. Supply chains that took decades to build are suddenly disrupted, and inserting 25% tariffs into this system caused them to seize up almost instantly. And the consequences aren't abstract. They are being felt in real time by businesses, communities, and entire states. China is the clear strategic winner. While America imposed tariffs hoping to pressure Canada, Beijing secured long-term access to a stable, growing supply of essential agricultural commodities, something it couldn't achieve through direct confrontation. Chinese food security, an absolute priority for the Communist Party, is now being strengthened through multi-year contracts that lock in Canadian supply for years, creating dependencies that will reshape trade dynamics for decades. Look at the numbers. China has been Canada's largest wheat importer for the past 5 years, accounting for roughly 10% of Canadian exports. With the new deal, that number is set to increase dramatically. Canola exports, previously constrained by 85% tariffs, now face only 15% barriers, and Chinese buyers are signing multi-year agreements to secure supply. But it's not just about tariffs. This is about deep strategic alignment. Canada has agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market annually at a 6.1% tariff, scaling up to 70,000 within 5 years. In return, China is investing in Canadian infrastructure, energy projects, and agriculture. State-owned Chinese enterprises are preparing to invest directly in processing facilities, storage capacity, and transport networks. Once that capital is embedded, these supply chains become permanent, almost impossible to disentangle. Carney is not naive. He explicitly stated this represents a new era in Canada-China relations, emphasizing realism, respect, and interest-based engagement. Translation: the US is unreliable, so Canada is building permanent alternatives. This development should alarm every American strategist. Carney was asked if China is now a more predictable partner than the United States, and he didn't hedge. He said, "In terms of the way our relationship has progressed recently with China, it is more predictable, and you see results from that." On the record, a Canadian Prime Minister has declared China more reliable than America. Meanwhile, as Canada restructures its trade, the European Union, Australia, and Argentina are positioning themselves to capture market share lost by the United States. EU nations aim to serve as stable suppliers for both Canadian and American markets. Australian wheat exporters emphasize reliability, free from tariff uncertainty, while Argentina expands grain production capacity to seize opportunities created by the disruption in North America. Every major player is watching the US stumble, ready to profit. The legal complexities compound the issue. The USMCA agreement, which replaced NAFTA, requires a formal review this year. Initially expected to be routine, it is now a high-stakes renegotiation where agricultural access will dominate discussions. Canada has made it clear that guaranteed market access and an end to arbitrary tariffs are preconditions for extending the agreement. Failure to meet these demands could trigger annual reviews, creating permanent uncertainty that discourages investment in North American trade integration. Essentially, tariffs meant to pressure Canada have handed them justification and leverage to pivot entirely away from US markets. The timeline is crucial. In the next few weeks, watch if the US offers meaningful tariff relief. If not, Canadian farmers will lock in long-term contracts with Chinese buyers, and planting decisions will cement supply chains toward Asia rather than America. Once that happens, the damage becomes permanent. The medium-term consequences will be equally stark. Supply chains will restructure. Cross-border processing facilities may close. Specialized logistics operations will shut down, and Canadian farmland will shift toward crops demanded by Asian markets. Wheat varieties favored by American buyers may be replaced with types desired by Chinese buyers, complicating any future reintegration. Long-term, this could alter North America's unparalleled food security. For decades, integrated production provided stability, but now that integration is fracturing, strategic control over one of the world's most productive agricultural regions is slipping, and authorities have yet to fully recognize the implications. The next decades of American agricultural policy will be shaped by these decisions, yet current planning remains reactive, with politicians largely silent or ineffective. Food security vulnerability is the endgame. Weaponizing trade against close allies sets off cascading effects that last generations. American families already face higher prices, but farmers, small businesses, and rural communities bear the brunt. A single plant closure in Kansas or Montana can devastate local employment. Stock markets are reflecting this instability, with agricultural equipment and fertilizer companies seeing declining investor confidence. Across the board, North American agricultural integration is under siege, and the ripple effects will last long after immediate headlines fade. Meanwhile, Canadian leaders like Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe celebrate the lifeline this deal provides to agriculture, while others, such as Ontario Premier Doug Ford, criticize the influx of subsidized Chinese vehicles. Ford's critique, while valid on one point, misses the larger picture. Carney didn't strike this deal for electric cars. He acted to protect Canadian agriculture in response to US tariffs. The strategic implications of this deal run far deeper than the immediate numbers suggest. Agricultural economists are already modeling long-term impacts, and the outlook is alarming. If current trade disruptions continue for more than 18 months, structural changes in North American supply chains will become permanent. Farmers make multi-year decisions about land use, equipment purchases, and crop selection. And once those decisions shift toward markets outside the US, reversing them requires massive capital investment and years of rebuilding relationships. History provides a chilling parallel. Decades ago, the US-Soviet grain embargo devastated American farmers because the Soviets simply turned to alternative suppliers. It took years to regain lost markets, and some customers never returned. Now a similar dynamic is playing out, except this time America is self-inflicting the damage, pushing its closest neighbor toward China. The political response in Washington has been weak. Congressional Republicans from agricultural states voice quiet concern, while Democrats criticize trade strategy, yet neither party has offered concrete solutions to reverse the damage. The result? North America is careening toward a structural economic disruption, while policymakers debate blame rather than act. To summarize the most critical points. First, Canada signed a comprehensive deal with China yesterday, effectively locking American buyers out of Canadian grain markets for the foreseeable future. This is not speculation, it's reality. Second, American consumers are already paying the price. Grain-based food prices have surged 12%, adding roughly $1,000 per year to a family of four's grocery bill, and costs will continue to rise as supply chain disruptions compound. Third, the breakdown of North American agricultural integration represents a self-inflicted strategic disaster that experts warn could take a generation to repair. America is voluntarily relinquishing control over one of the most productive, integrated agricultural regions on the planet, and the consequences extend beyond economics into national security. Weaponizing food trade against allies inevitably produces cascading effects. Canadian farmers find new customers, supply chains reorient toward Asia, and American families bear the cost at grocery stores. The underlying issue isn't abstract tariffs or policy debate. It's the concrete outcome of decisions made without consultation, planning, or transition. The US did not account for supply chain realities when imposing blunt 25% tariffs on Canadian agriculture. No provisions were made for gradual adjustment, alternative sourcing, or mitigation. The result is predictable. Canadian agriculture pivots to stable, high-paying Asian markets, while American farmers, processors, transporters, and local communities face collapsing revenues and lost livelihoods. Family-owned grain processing plants shut down, specialized trucking firms go bankrupt, and rural communities lose employment opportunities that will never return. Across the Midwest and Great Plains, the ripple effect is already visible as infrastructure designed for integrated North American trade struggles to adapt. Railroads, port facilities, and storage elevators all face declining volumes and operational inefficiencies, compounding the economic strain. Meanwhile, the giants of global grain trading are quietly recalibrating their strategies. Firms that manage the majority of global food flows are reducing exposure to the volatile North American corridor, shifting procurement towards South America and Australia, where regulatory certainty and stable tariffs protect their investments. This is more than risk management. It is a structural realignment of supply, processing, and logistics infrastructure away from the US-Canada corridor. The early data are already striking. Agricultural exports to Canada are down 6% through September, amounting to $1.3 billion in lost trade, and that only captures immediate impacts. The long-term damage, stemming from planting choices, contract commitments, and multi-year investment decisions, is just beginning. Canadian exports to China, previously valued at $13 billion annually, are now targeted to reach $250 billion through non-US markets, with agriculture forming a substantial component. Carney's explicit strategy is to reduce dependence on an unpredictable US market, cementing Chinese partnership through long-term agreements, pricing incentives, and embedded infrastructure. This shift has immediate effects on American farmers. Wheat growers in Montana and North Dakota, long accustomed to blending their crops with Canadian wheat to meet export specifications, are scrambling to find alternative suppliers. Prices for domestic substitutes are rising, eroding margins, while Canadian farmers pivot toward Asian markets, offering higher prices and tariff certainty. Transportation firms specializing in cross-border agricultural logistics report 40–60% volume drops. Small, family-operated trucking businesses, often running 5 to 10 trucks along the same routes for decades, are at risk of collapse. Railways that once handled record grain volumes face uncertainty over future shipments. Ports in Seattle and Portland, dependent on Canadian flows, see reduced activity, while elevator operators and processing plants operate below optimal capacity. Every link in the integrated supply chain experiences simultaneous disruption, illustrating how a single policy decision cascades across multiple sectors. The disruption doesn't stop with immediate logistics. The real shock is in long-term strategic positioning. The largest agricultural trading companies, the ones that actually control global food flows, are quietly reshaping their procurement strategies. They're moving away from integrated North American supply chains, prioritizing regulatory certainty over marginal cost savings. Processing facilities, storage infrastructure, and logistics networks are being redirected towards South American and Australian suppliers. Once investment shifts, the change becomes effectively permanent. And here's the part that should terrify American policymakers. Agricultural exports to Canada have already dropped 6% through September, translating to $1.3 billion in lost trade. But the most significant impacts are invisible right now, buried in planting decisions, long-term contracts, and infrastructure investment choices being made by Canadian farmers and Chinese buyers. Canadian agriculture, previously focused on the US, is now strategically aligned with China. Multi-year contracts, premium pricing, and guaranteed markets are drawing production away from the US, creating dependencies that will last decades. Carney's strategy is methodical. By reducing reliance on the unpredictable American market, Canada secures stability with Chinese buyers willing to commit to long-term contracts. This isn't speculation. This is happening while Canadian farmers make planting decisions for spring crops. Wheat varieties will shift to meet Chinese preferences, while American requirements take a back seat. Supply chains, once centered on cross-border trucking to U.S. processing facilities, will reorient toward Pacific shipping routes. Chinese investment in Canadian infrastructure processing plants, storage facilities, transport networks ensures that once this capital is in place, the relationship becomes effectively permanent. Reversing these changes would require massive investment and decades to restore, making short-term policy corrections in Washington nearly irrelevant. This is not a temporary trade disagreement. It is a structural transformation in North American agriculture that alters the balance of food production, processing, and export for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, American consumers are already paying for these shifts. Food prices for wheat-based products jumped 12% in the weeks following the tariffs, costing a typical family of four an extra $960 annually. But beyond grocery bills, the real issue is systemic. Supply chains meticulously built over 70 years are unraveling. Consider family-owned grain processing operations in the U.S., like the one in Kansas, employing 140 people. Tariffs increased their raw material costs by 28%, yet passing these costs to customers risks losing contracts to international competitors. They face a stark choice: absorb losses and risk bankruptcy or shut down entirely. Similar scenarios are unfolding across the Midwest and Great Plains, affecting farmers, trucking firms, railroads, ports, and storage facilities. Every specialized link in the supply chain is facing simultaneous disruption, highlighting the fragility of integration once political interference interferes with decades of commercial planning. Beyond immediate business impacts, these changes are recalibrating market power. Large global grain traders, who dictate the flow of food worldwide, are strategically reducing exposure to North American supply chains. Regulatory certainty now outweighs minimal cost advantages. This shift directs investment towards South America and Australia, permanently altering the infrastructure for procurement, storage, and processing. American agriculture is losing influence in a region it once dominated. The broader strategic implication is staggering. North American food security, historically guaranteed by integrated production and reliable supply chains, is fracturing. Canadian farmers, incentivized by Chinese contracts, will continue to shift production toward Asian markets, while U.S. farmers face higher costs, disrupted supplier relationships, and shrinking market access. The result is not a temporary inconvenience, it's a systemic, long-term reorientation of North American agriculture. Political reactions in Washington highlight the inadequacy of the response. Congressional Republicans quietly express concern, while Democrats criticize trade policy in general terms. Yet, neither party is offering actionable solutions. Meanwhile, Canadian leaders are acting decisively. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe celebrates the deal as a lifeline for Canadian agriculture, while Ontario Premier Doug Ford criticizes the influx of subsidized Chinese vehicles, but misses the broader economic rationale. Carney's moves were driven by necessity, not preference. Trump's tariffs forced Canada to find new markets, and China offered the stability and pricing American farmers and policymakers failed to provide. Economists project that if disruptions persist beyond 18 months, structural changes in supply chains will become permanent as multi-year agricultural decisions lock in new trade patterns, making future reintegration prohibitively costly. The historical parallels make this even more concerning. Decades ago, the US-Soviet grain embargo devastated American farmers because the Soviets simply found alternative suppliers. Markets were lost for years, and some customers never returned. Now, the United States is inflicting a similar wound on itself, alienating its closest neighbor while Canada actively pivots toward China. American agriculture faces the combined effects of higher input costs, disrupted supplier relationships, and the permanent redirection of Canadian production. The consequences ripple across rural communities, where agricultural processing plants are often the primary employers. When these facilities close, workers cannot simply find alternative jobs, and local economies collapse. Stock markets are already reflecting the uncertainty, with equipment manufacturers and fertilizer companies seeing declining share prices as investors question future demand. Meanwhile, Canadian leaders celebrate newfound stability and access to Asian markets, fully aware that long-term contracts with China ensure their agricultural sector's survival and growth, even as American farmers struggle to adapt. The broader geopolitical impact is equally significant. Carney publicly stated that China has become a more predictable partner than the United States, highlighting a stark shift in trust and reliability. European nations, Australia and Argentina, are all positioning themselves to capture opportunities created by disrupted North American supply chains. EU countries aim to serve as stable alternative suppliers for both American and Canadian markets, while Australian wheat exporters market reliability free from tariff uncertainty. Argentina expands grain production capacity to seize market share lost to North American disruptions. Every major player is recalibrating in response to American policy missteps, turning what was intended as pressure into strategic advantage for competitors. The US, meanwhile, loses leverage. Canada now negotiates from strength, demanding guaranteed access and protection from arbitrary tariffs as a condition for USMCA renegotiations, fundamentally shifting the power dynamic. The immediate, medium-term, and long-term consequences are clear. In the short term, American farmers, processors, and logistics operators face collapsing volumes, higher costs, and uncertainty. Medium-term, supply chains restructure, processing plants close, transportation networks shrink, and Canadian farmland pivots to Asian markets. Wheat varieties shift to meet Chinese demand, and reintegration becomes more difficult with every planting cycle. Long-term, North America's integrated agricultural system fractures, undermining food security and control over one of the world's most productive regions. Strategic advantages that took 70 years to build are being voluntarily surrendered. Weaponizing trade against allies has created cascading consequences that threaten entire industries, communities, and the cost of living for ordinary American families. The 12% spike in wheat-based product prices is only the beginning. Disruptions will continue to reverberate across the supply chain, from farm to table. The situation also exposes the limits of political action. Congressional voices expressing concern remain largely muted, while partisan debate offers no tangible solutions. American policymakers are struggling to respond to a reality where decades of integrated supply chains and trusted partnerships have been upended by abrupt tariffs. Canadian leadership, conversely, has acted decisively, securing alternative markets and embedding long-term contracts with Chinese buyers. State-owned Chinese enterprises are investing in Canadian infrastructure, guaranteeing that the new supply chains are permanent. Multi-year agreements, embedded logistics networks, and predictable pricing cement China's role as a primary partner, leaving the United States at a strategic disadvantage. Ultimately, the key takeaway is stark. Trade decisions have consequences far beyond the numbers on a spreadsheet. Weaponizing food trade against close allies guarantees that new partnerships will form, leaving American consumers paying higher prices and domestic farmers facing shrinking opportunities. Canada has secured stability, China has strengthened its food security and influence, and the United States is watching its integrated agricultural advantage unravel. This is one of the most significant self-inflicted economic wounds in modern American history, and its effects will be felt for a generation. The story unfolding is not abstract or theoretical. It is happening now, impacting families, businesses, and the very structure of North American agriculture. The question remains, is this trade strategy truly protecting American interests, or is it inadvertently dismantling one of the nation's greatest strategic assets? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because from where I'm sitting, we are witnessing history unfold.